who's going to be speaking about his new book, The American Natural History Museum, and how it got that way. Colin Davies' life was shaped by frequent visits to the American Museum of Natural History and the Hayden Planetarium as a child. He's a scientist, software engineer, martial artist, and author of Learn Boogie Woogie Piano. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colin Davies.
Hey. Thanks so much. Great to be here. Great to be back in New York City, my hometown. So yesterday, back in Oregon where I live, I realized I was starting to get hoarse, and I was like, great, I have to take a red eye from Oregon, give 2 talks and a radio interview in the next 3 days. And then, so I took the red eye. The flight arrived at 5 a.m. this morning. Managed to get a little sleep on the plane, but airplane sleep doesn't really count. But then when I emerged from Penn Station and got that whiff of bus diesel and urine, I knew I was home, and my pace started to quicken, and my eyes got that gleam, and I walked around 7 miles. So you all look like giant lizards to me right now, and if anything goes wrong, that's why. Let me start by reading a selection from the book, which is how this book came to be written. This book would have never been written if I, like so many New York City children, had not grown up visiting the American Museum of Natural History and Hayden Planetarium countless times as a youngster. My mother, a native New Yorker who taught science in the city's public schools, herself made regular visits to the museum and planetarium when she was young. And as was the case for so many New Yorkers, the museum and planetarium were a favorite destination for family outings for as long as I can remember. I learned to read at the museum. My mother tells the story of how when I was 3 or 4, I would look at the exhibits and spell out the labels. Tiger, tiger. Bear, bear. Bluemarlin, fish. When I was a student, the museum and planetarium were frequent destinations for field trips. The museum's gift shops and the planetarium's book corner were my parents' go-to destinations for birthday and Christmas presents. I began going to the museum on my own at the age of 7. I lived on Hudson Street, so I just got on the 7th Avenue bus, and it would drop me off right in front of the museum. And I'll reveal something now that I don't think I ever told anyone before, which is that one time when I was crossing Central Park West, I almost got hit by a car. But I didn't tell my mother. It's just, yeah, maybe I was a little too young. But I went so often that a planetarium employee eventually recognized me. That part's not in the book, that part. I just introduced himself saying, "From now on, you get in for free. Just say you're with me, Mark Toomey. I work at the book corner. To remember my name, just think Toomey as in Sock It To Me." At the time, Sock It To Me was a catchphrase from the popular TV show Laugh-In, a phrase that even presidential candidate Richard Nixon had uttered during a cameo appearance on the show. "Sock it to me." I haven't seen Mr. Toomey since I was 7, but I would be delighted to remake his acquaintance. If any reader knows him, please put him in touch with me. So anyway, so many years later, I had taken up an interest in, having moved to Oregon, I had taken up an interest in all things New York, kind of nostalgically, and at this time, the Rose Center for Earth and Space had been up for like maybe 10, 15 years. And I started remembering the old days at the Hayden Planetarium, and I thought, let's learn something about that. Just dig up some information on it. it was like really hard to find any reference to it at all, because if you search on Hayden Planetarium, all that came up was information on the Rose Center for Earth and Space. And like, if you did your search phrase just right, you might get an inkling of something about the old planetarium. So, but then I discovered a discussion about the scene in the Woody Allen movie, Annie Hall, that takes place in the planetarium. And someone had, on a blog, and someone had made a comment about how he used to be a senior lecturer there. And, you know, too bad, though it's gone. And Tom L. And then somewhere else, I saw, in a similar kind of language, another comment about the planetarium by a T. Lesser. So then, oh, okay, there's someone named Tom Lesser out there, and I had a hard time finding him, but I finally found a column that he was still doing recently on a Caribbean, a magazine about the Caribbean, where he had a column about the stars in the sky. And then I contacted them and said, oh, can you put me in touch with Tom Lesser? And they did. And so I sent him an email, and after he was like, who are you and how did you get a hold of me? We then exchanged maybe 100 emails in like the next 6 to 8 weeks. And so the project gathered steam, and I realized there's not that much information out there about the Hayden Planetarium. Now I've made contact with Thomas Lesser. Maybe there should be a book about it. And let me back up by saying that this is my second book. My first book was Learn Boogie Woogie Piano. And I don't really consider myself an author. Like a lot of people who write books, it's just like writing is what they do. If they're just going to find some way to spend their time writing because they love to write. That's not me. But my thing is that I love learning. So I will get interested in different things and learn about it. Like if I take an interest in something, I'll go down to a bookstore and get some books on it. And that's how it worked out with Learn Boogie Woogie Piano, is that I figured I want to learn how to play this stuff. I'll go down to the music store and get some books on it and learn how to play it. And there wasn't any. And then I'd have to dig it up and eventually realize that I guess I now know enough to write a book, and there seems to be a need for a book. So that's the story behind Learn Boogie Woogie Piano. So then I continued happily not writing books and just buying the books I needed for anything I was trying to learn, and came around to this situation once again where there was no book on it. I was just curious enough about it to learn enough about it till all of a sudden I realized, oh, maybe I should write the book. So that's how this got started. And then in the process of learning about the Hayden Planetarium, it's so connected to the museum, I mean literally, physically, as well as in every other way. I realized, you know, I could write a book about the museum at this point. And so I pitched books about the Hayden Planetarium to publishers. And I said, by the way, I'm all ready for the second book. If you like my first book, I have another one planned on the museum. And then the Fordham University Press guys, Will and Fred over here, said, if you can turn them into one book, you got a deal. And so that's what happened. And so part 2 of this book is about the planetarium, and part 1 is about the museum. And I'm not gonna get into the planetarium too much tonight, even though that's how this book got started, because I just don't have that much time. But I'm giving a talk at the Vanderbilt Planetarium Wednesday, a short talk there, and that one will be more planetarium heavy. But I'll give you a sense of how the research flowed. It turned out to be a lot harder project than I thought. I gathered like a handful of books on the museum, and they all covered certain topics in their own way. And I figured, wow, if I just collate the information from these different sources together, then I would just pretty much have it and then just fill in the blanks as necessary. But it turns out that doesn't really work. There's so many holes. After I do that, there's so many questions left over, holes and places where one source contradicts another, and I have to figure out who's right. So ultimately, it ended up being a much bigger project than I thought, and I ended up combing through archives, over 100 annual reports of the museum, various reports from other institutions, dozens of museum and planetarium guidebooks from 1904 to present, doing numerous interviews, reading about 1,000 New York Times articles from like 1860 to present. So it turned out the story was much more rich and complicated than I imagined. For example, Dinosaurs in the Attic, which is one of the main books on the museum, and American Museum of Natural History, 125 years of expedition and discovery by Lyle Rexer and Rachel Klein. They both covered the museum's founding. I figured if I could piece it together, what I needed from there. So my book talks about the attempt to create a Paleozoic museum by a British writer and lecturer who was also an artist who made dinosaur models. And the ill fate of that at the hands of the Tweed Ring. And then both books had this little bit about the museum's founders petitioning the commissioners of Central Park for support for creating the Museum of Natural History. And both books briefly described that they got a positive response from Park Commissioner Andrew Green. So I think to myself, they both mention Andrew Green. Just to be thorough, let's look up this Green guy. How many people here have heard of Andrew Haswell Green? No one? How many people, for example, have heard of Robert Moses? Yeah. Or Boss Tweed? Well, okay, so I don't feel too bad because, I considered myself a pretty knowledgeable New York City history guy with several rows of shelves on the topic, but I had never heard of Andrew Haswell Green. And by the way, Robert Moses does play a big part in this story. When I discovered that to do this story, I would have to write new things about Robert Moses, that's kind of when I was back and forth of, do I really want to write a book or not? When I realized that I'm going to be contributing to the Robert Moses literature, that's kind of what tipped me over into, kind of going ahead with the project. And both of those books talked about how Albert Bickmore, the founder of the museum, had to personally petition a Senator, Boss Tweed, for the law that established the museum. So let's talk about Boss Tweed a little. So it turns out that there's much more to the story than just those brief mentions in those books contained. And I realized why. Those books were basing their research on a autobiography of Albert Bickmore, the museum's founder, that he wrote in 1908. And that's what he mentions. That's how he mentions. He just says, I had to go to a senator named Tweed. I had to petition the commissioner, Andrew Green. And so these books included that. But it turns out it's a much richer story than just that. So Boss Tweed enjoyed a meteoric rise to power throughout the 1860s through graft, corruption, and voter fraud. In 1968, Tweed, now a senator, by the way, he had been a U.S. congressman prior to that, had his hand-picked cronies become the city's mayor and the state's governor. And this was exactly at the time that Bickmore was getting to work on creating his museum. And then in 1870, something was passed that was referred to as the Tweed Charter, that was carefully designed to, specifically for the purpose of increasing Boss Tweed's power. And it allowed him to install his cronies in the offices of controller, president of Department Parks, and himself as commissioner of public works, all the while getting massive graft and kickbacks. Anyway, Andrew Haswell Green, who not many of us, and not me back then, had ever heard of, turns out he's like one of the most important, consequential yet unsung figures in New York City history. Something that I hope this book will help to rectify. Besides playing a key role in the founding of the museum, he was one of the most important players in the creation of Central Park. As controller of the Central Park Commission, he was essentially the boss of Olmsted and Vaux, who are the people most famously associated with Central Park. He was also a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Public Library and the Bronx Zoo. And at the time that this business with getting the museum started, at the time that was happening, where he was helping the museum get started, he also hatched a plot with Samuel Tilden that used some infighting that had recently broken out in the Tweed Ring to take down the ring almost overnight in late 1871. Shortly afterwards, Tweed was arrested and ended up spending the rest of his life in and out of jail as other members of his ring went into exile. Then, after Tweed was gone, Green stepped into the role as city controller, and he had to clean up the debt and the corruption that the Tweed regime had installed, at the time guaranteeing some of the city's debt with his own money, while maintaining his role with Central Park. And several months after this coup, Green was responsible for making the final selection for the site of the museum, where it is on Manhattan Square. And on top of all that, it was Green who led the effort to unite Manhattan with Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island into what we now know as New York City. So those who are familiar with him know him as the father of New York City. So this book weaves that whole story into the founding of the museum and how it got its site, while also weaving that into the growth of Manhattan. Like take, for example, Central Park. Central Park, the idea of Central Park came into being in 1850. So in 1811 is when the commissioners of New York City created the plan for having an even grid of streets. So all the way up from like Greenwich Village up to the 100s. That's why everything below like Greenwich Village is a mess. So they made this whole map of New York City, the part that hadn't been built yet, arranged as a grid. There was no Central Park in that map, but Manhattan Square was in that map. And Manhattan Square is the site of the museum. So the site of the museum right now, that is across from Central Park and was eventually annexed into Central Park, existed in 1811, decades before anyone had thought of Central Park. And it also goes into the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Historical Society. So that's just chapter one. That's chapter one of the book, which takes us to the place from the beginning of New York City history to where they've established Central Park and the museum in its site that it has now, and that hadn't even been built yet. And also in that chapter, we see that before the museum got its building, they were located in the Armory building in Central Park, which existed actually before Central Park. That was a temporary home for it. At the same time that they opened up that building in the Armory, they were also casting about for the site, for the permanent site, which ended up being where it is now. Yeah, so that's chapter 1. And then we go into the various stages of the building that they were built in, the order they were built in, the politics around that. We go into the dinosaur exhibits, a chapter on the evolution of the dinosaur exhibits. And what I referred to earlier of the Robert Moses material. And I know a lot of you have heard of him, but just to review, he was the most powerful man in New York City and state from the 1920s through the 1960s. Very controversial, took out whole neighborhoods controversially. He also invented Jones Beach, so we like some of his work, you know. He was responsible for the 1939-1964 World's Fair, the United Nations, Lincoln Center, tunnels and bridges. But despite several books about Moses in his career, there's one like this thick, the famous one by Robert Cairo, and he had to leave out a whole piece of the history, which was when Moses wanted to put a freeway like through Washington Square Park. That didn't even really make it into his book just because it was too long already. And so someone else wrote a book about that. So there are major books about him, but none of them talk about his role with the museum. So that's when I was like, aha, I could write an interesting book now. He was instrumental in getting the Hayden Planetarium financed during the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration as part of the New Deal and part of like the WPA type of programs. And then when Charles Hayden threw a celebration for the opening of the planetarium, while Hayden was still on the dais, Moses said, "Charlie, never in the history of philanthropy has anyone earned immortality so cheaply." So, I mean, he was kind of a dick, but you know, that's it. And then he had a plan to totally redo the planetarium in the 40s. The attendance wasn't so good, and he had this whole idea he brought in Norman Bell Geddes, who was a theatrical designer who also designed exhibits for the World's Fair, and they came up with a whole plan to totally redo the museum, the planetarium, and that didn't happen. And then he also put the kibosh on an idea that Henry Fairfield Osborne, there's a whole chapter on the Osborne regime, because that's when many of the buildings that are part of the museum now were built. The Roosevelt Memorial, pretty much everything except the bottom, except for like the 77th Street entrance, was built under the Osborne era. Except for the Rose Center for Earth and Space, but that replaced an existing building that wasn't really, so it's not as big a amount of building as what happened during the Osborne era. But Osborne wanted to put a road through Central Park connecting the Metropolitan Museum of Art to the Museum of Natural History, and Robert Moses finally put the kibosh on that. So that's another one of his roles in this story. And the president of the museum at the time that the planetarium was finally funded and built was F. Truby Davison. So he had an interesting history with Moses. Back in 1920s, when Moses was an aide to Al Smith. He hadn't really gotten involved in New York City. He was focusing on Long Island. Moses's period of taking an interest in New York City began with the Hayden Planetarium, but before that, he had to build, he built Jones Beach on Long Island. And there was a lot of opposition to the people who lived there. Long Island was nothing like it is now. It was more like it was in, Scott Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby, yeah. So it was populated by the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, who didn't want a beach for the regular old city people. Yeah. So F. Truby Davison was a young assemblyman, and Moses suckered him into introducing a bill that had all this innocuous language in it that really gave Moses all the power he needed to build Jones Beach. And so Davison felt very bad about that, and then Davison becomes president of the Museum of Natural History, and he works with Moses to get the Hayden Planetarium funded. It gets funded in 1933 during the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration. It gets built in 1935, and in between then is the only time Moses ever ran for office. He ran against Governor Lehman for governor of the state, and his campaign manager was F. Truby Davison. And he lost, and he never ran again, and he was more powerful than any of the mayors or governors or people who came and went as he was there decade after decade in multiple official titles, such as Commissioner of Parks, Commissioner of the Tri-Road Bridge Authority, etc., etc. So late in life, everyone's retired, and Moses's final thing that he wanted to do was he wanted to connect Long Island to Westchester with a highway. And in that capacity, he was in mortal deadlock with F. Truby Davison, who lived in the part of Long Island where it would have let out. So that turns out Davison had trained his dog to bark whenever he said Robert Moses. And that never did happen. Governor Nelson Rockefeller announced his decision to discontinue the plan for its construction. But even when Moses was 88, he said, "I'm not beaten yet on the Sound crossing." So that's about what I got.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. That's about the amount of time we have.
Part of that for you. So we can do like 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. If you guys have any questions, just ask away. You can call, and I'll let you know when we got to do about 2 more.
Okay,
Yeah.
Sounds great. Yes.
I imagine the museum has archives. Did you have access to the museum's archival records?
Yes, I did. In fact, the person who helped me unlock those archives is sitting right in the row in front of you. Senior research librarian of the museum, May Reitmeyer. Am I pronouncing that right? Yes. So I had maybe, 5 visits or so. And yeah. Yes.
What was Manhattan Square? Was it actually an improved part or just in weeds and rubble?
What was it at, like originally when it appeared in 1811, you mean?
Yeah, was it just an empty lot, or did they run the structure start with the layout like a park?
Well, there were no streets built at that time past like roughly 14th Street. But it was planned to be a park. Like there were certain squares that were, the sum total of park space was sort of laid out, and one of them was Manhattan Square. And I forget the others, but they probably were like Washington Square, Union Square, but they hadn't really been built yet, but just kind of planned out.
So the museum was the first actual use of that land?
Yes, although there were other plans for it before it ended up that the museum would be there. For a while they were planning on building a zoo there, for example. Yeah.
anything how a landmark got overturned to get demolished, the Hayden Planetarium to build the Rose Center? Did you find anything out on that at all? It's kind of a curious chapter.
Yeah. They made a case that wasn't it wasn't specifically landmark. The museum in general was, and parts of the museum. So they made the case that wasn't that important of a landmark in that sense. Yeah, there's a whole document about that and articles from the New York Times that and so I discussed some of that. But yeah.
So in writing the book, what was your greatest aha moment?
Discovering Andrew Haswell Green.
Okay.
I mean, he's really as an important person as Robert Moses or anyone else, Peter Stuyvesant, Boston, anyone you could think of in New York City history. And we have all these scholars here, and no one's ever heard of him. I think he should.
I hadn't heard of him until I read your book.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a book about him and some PhD thesis about him, but he's not as well known as he should be.
Yeah, there's
obviously.
no monument to him in the city, is there?
Right. I think there are plans for like maybe a park bench in Central Park somewhere or something like that. So, yeah. Yes.
How was Norman Belgetti's plans received by the museum and the planetarium staff? Some of his ideas were very much ahead of his time, and he's a well-known designer. He could deliver well, and it sounded like it was brought in by Moses to from kind of like an outside review. But was there any sense of how the museum received his ideas?
There isn't that much of a sense that I could find. Like the Board of Trustee discussions about it are sort of off limits. But according to Robert Moses, the museum people didn't find it scientific enough, or they found it anti-scientific. But that was him talking about their reaction to it. I didn't see any reaction by them of it, and I found what I could find was like, this just isn't a good time financially. We're in World War II now, and so the Charles Hayden Foundation said we don't really have the money, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is the New Deal agency, said this isn't a good time for the money. But I do know that in 1960, when the Hayden Planetarium got a new projector, and everyone, a bunch of dignitaries gave speeches when they started the new projector, Robert Moses was one of the speakers, and even then he was still saying, I think we should have gone with the Norman Belgetti's plan. And then in the book he wrote in the 70s, when must be 80, or he repeated it in that book that he still would have, just like he still wanted to do the crossing from, yeah. There we go.
Would have shortened my commute.
Yeah. What's that?
Would have shortened my commute.
Yeah. Right.
Can do maybe like 2 more questions?
Yes.
Can you talk about Margaret Mead and her impact or relationship to the museum?
Yes. And my book does touch upon it, but the main arc of the book is like how the museum grew physically. And that's one thing that makes it different from other books, which talk a lot about expeditions that happened. And with some of the other books that have been written, it's hard to take an adventure that you're reading about and associate that with a thing in the museum, a physical thing. So I do talk about some of the expedition, but so Margaret Mead didn't quite fit into my story arc, but I do mention her, and I can tell you that first of all, her teacher Franz Boas was one of the museum's, I think maybe the first major anthropologist. He left the museum and was a teacher at Columbia, where he was one of her professors. Decades after he was no longer with the museum, and then she came to work for the museum, and then in this I think it's the 60s or maybe 70s, they opened the Margaret Mead Hall, and then that was redone and moved after her death. But yeah, she was actually one of the museum's most well-known employees. But yeah, she was an anthropologist there, and she helped curate a hall. And, yeah. Yes.
I apologize in advance if this was asked already, but what inspired you to write this particular book and/or what is your personal connection to the museum?
Well, going to the museum frequently as a kid. Yeah, I did talk about that, and that's covered in the section called "How This Book Came to Be Written." But basically, I grew up going to the museum very frequently. When I was 7, my mom sent me there like during that summer, like almost every week on my own, and all my Christmas and birthday presents were from the museum gift shop. And yeah, my mom was a science teacher, so yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to Davey. And wonderful talk. So you'll be here signing books. You can purchase them up at the register if you don't have one already, and otherwise you can hang out here if you want.
Okay.
Wherever you feel. Do you have a pen, or do you want me to grab you a Sharpie, or?